The fragmentation of modern moral discourse. Modern moral philosophy, as Alasdair MacIntyre argues in After Virtue, is in a state of profound disarray, a cacophony of competing claims masquerading as rational debate. The language of ethics, once rooted in shared traditions and teleological frameworks, has been reduced to emotive assertions, abstract duties, and calculative outcomes, each divorced from any coherent conception of the good life. This disintegration, MacIntyre contends, is not merely theoretical but manifests itself in the incoherence of our moral judgments, where appeals to rights, utility, or personal preference clash without resolution. Consider the emotivist stance, which reduces moral statements to expressions of individual preference. Murder is wrong becomes little more than I dislike murder. Such a view, MacIntyre observes, renders moral debate meaningless, transforming ethical discourse into a contest of subjective feelings rather than reasoned deliberation. The emotivist cannot explain why one preference should hold sway over another, nor can they account for the communal foundations of moral reasoning. When a politician declares war just and a protester decries it as barbaric, emotivism offers no arbiter but power or persuasion. Deontological ethics, epitomized by Kant's categorical imperative, fares no better in MacIntyre's critique. By severing duty from any conception of human flourishing, Kantianism elevates abstract rationality above the lived realities of moral agents. A Kantian might argue that lying is always wrong even to save a life, because universalizing falsehood would undermine trust. Yet this rigidity ignores the contextual wisdom of virtue ethics, where honesty is tempered by compassion and prudence. Duty untethered from telos becomes a hollow formalism, incapable of guiding action in the complexities of human relationships. Utilitarianism, with its focus on maximizing happiness, appears more pragmatic but collapses under its own reductivism. When Bentham reduces all moral considerations to the calculus of pleasure and pain, he erases qualitative distinctions, equating the joy of artistic creation with the satisfaction of a full stomach. MacIntyre highlights how this quantitative approach fails to address which pleasures constitute a good life, or why some goods, friendship, justice, courage, cannot be measured on a hedonic scale. A society that pursues utility alone may sacrifice justice for efficiency, as seen in industrial-era labor exploitation justified by economic growth. Against these fractured frameworks, MacIntyre resurrects Aristotle's virtue ethics, where morality is inseparable from communal practices and the cultivation of character. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Aristotle defines virtue as excellence achieved through habituation. One becomes just by doing just acts, courageous by facing fear. Unlike emotivism's arbitrariness or Kant's abstract rules, virtue ethics embeds morality in the concrete realities of human life, where goods are internal to practices. Think of the integrity of the craftsman, whose pride in his work transcends mere profit. Central to MacIntyre's revival is the concept of narrative unity, the idea that a life well lived is a coherent story directed toward eudaimonia, flourishing. Modern individualism, by contrast, fractures life into disconnected roles: worker, consumer, citizen, each governed by alien standards. The Aristotelian tradition, as expanded in Eudemian Ethics, Book 8, grounds ethics in friendship, philia, and the common good, where virtues are nurtured through shared pursuit of excellence. A community that values courage, for instance, does so not as a private ideal, but as a collective necessity for its survival and integrity. MacIntyre's critique extends to the Enlightenment's failed project, which sought universal moral principles while jettisoning the traditions that gave them meaning. The result is a moral landscape where rights are invoked without agreement on their foundation, and where moral language persists as a simulacrum of its former coherence. To reclaim ethics, MacIntyre insists, we must return to tradition-constituted rationality, not as nostalgic revivalism, but as the only path out of modernity's impasse. The stakes are high. In a world where moral discourse is reduced to power struggles or technical management, the loss of virtue leaves us ill-equipped to confront crises, ecological collapse, political tyranny, or the alienation of late capitalism. MacIntyre's Aristotelian corrective is not a retreat to the past, but a demand to rebuild ethics from the ground up through practices that cultivate wisdom, justice, and the humility to recognize our dependence on one another. The question remains, can modernity in its fragmentation heed this call? The consequences of this moral fragmentation extend beyond theoretical incoherence. They shape the very fabric of contemporary life. In the absence of a shared moral vocabulary, public discourse devolves into what MacIntyre terms the rhetoric of incommensurability, where opposing sides speak past one another, invoking irreconcilable principles. Consider debates over bioethics. Proponents of assisted dying frame autonomy as the highest good, while opponents appeal to the sanctity of life. Neither side can persuade the other because their premises belong to divergent moral universes. The result is not dialogue, but stalemate, resolved only by legislative force or cultural attrition. This incommensurability is exacerbated by modernity's bureaucratic individualism, which reduces ethics to procedural fairness or personal choice. Institutions codify rules to manage conflict, workplace harassment policies, international human rights charters, yet these frameworks often lack the thicker moral substance needed to inspire genuine ethical commitment. A corporation may enforce anti-discrimination policies while perpetuating systemic inequities, because compliance is not the same as justice. Similarly, the language of rights, detached from any account of human purpose, becomes a tool for asserting interests rather than fostering solidarity. The right to free speech, for instance, is weaponized in debates where civility and truth are secondary to victory. Even attempts to bridge these divides, such as John Rawls's theory of justice as fairness, fall prey to modernity's thin moral assumptions. Rawls' veil of ignorance, while elegantly rational, abstracts away the particularities of tradition, identity, and virtue that animate real moral reasoning. As MacIntyre notes, no actual person deliberates behind such a veil. We are always already embedded in histories and communities. The liberal hope that overlapping consensus can replace shared moral foundations underestimates the depth of our disagreements. When justice is reduced to neutrality, it risks becoming indifferent to the very virtues, courage, generosity, humility, that sustain a just society. The fragmentation of moral discourse also erodes personal agency. In a world where values are treated as consumer preferences, individuals are left to assemble their own patchwork ethics, borrowing piecemeal from philosophies, religions, and self-help trends. This buffered self, as Charles Taylor describes it, imagines itself autonomous but is often adrift, lacking the narratives that once gave life direction. The rise of existential anxiety and identity crises in late modernity reflects this vacuum. Where Aristotle saw the self as constituted by its roles and relationships, the modern self is told it can and must choose itself, yet is given no criteria for choice beyond authenticity or utility. MacIntyre's diagnosis is thus not merely academic. It explains the pervasive sense of disorientation in contemporary culture. The resurgence of ideological tribalism, for example, can be read as a desperate attempt to reclaim narrative unity in a world that denies it. Political movements, whether nationalist or progressive, often function as substitute traditions, offering adherents a semblance of a shared purpose. Yet without the depth of genuine moral traditions rooted in practices, not just slogans, these movements frequently replicate the very power struggles they claim to oppose. The path forward, MacIntyre suggests, lies not in grand theories but in local, practice-based communities where virtue can be rediscovered. Monasteries, labor unions, and even grassroots activism exemplify this possibility. small-scale context where moral language regains its connection to lived experience. Here, virtues like solidarity or perseverance are not abstract ideals, but necessities for collective survival. The challenge is whether such communities can resist co-optation by the very forces of fragmentation they seek to counter. Ultimately, MacIntyre's critique forces a reckoning. Modernity's moral crisis cannot be solved by more sophisticated versions of the same fractured frameworks. Only by re-embedding ethics and traditions of practice, where goods are discovered, not chosen, can we hope to mend what has been broken. The task is as urgent as it is daunting. The illusion of moral progress. Despite modernity's claim of ethical advancement, MacIntyre argues that the abandonment of teleological frameworks has left moral progress illusory. Appeals to human rights or social justice often mask a deeper incoherence, where principles are invoked without agreement on their justification. What passes as progress is frequently a reshuffling of power, not a genuine evolution of moral understanding. Take the Enlightenment's promise of universal reason, liberating humanity from dogma. In practice, this project replaced one set of authorities, church and monarchy, with another, bureaucratic institutions and market logic. The French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man, for instance, proclaimed liberty while enabling the terror. Moral language became a tool for ideological enforcement, not collective flourishing. The same pattern recurs in contemporary movements that invoke justice while replicating exclusionary tactics. This paradox stems from modernity's rejection of tradition as a source of moral knowledge. Without the grounding of shared narratives, ethical principles float untethered, easily co-opted by dominant interests. Corporations adopt diversity initiatives while resisting wage equity. Governments champion democracy while undermining civil liberties. MacIntyre likens this to building on sand. No matter how lofty the rhetoric, the foundation cannot hold. The consequences are evident in the commodification of morality itself. Ethical consumption, buying fair trade or eco-friendly products, exemplifies how virtue is reduced to individual market choices. Such acts may alleviate guilt but do little to challenge systemic injustice. Meanwhile, structural evils like climate change or wealth inequality persist, precisely because they demand collective action beyond consumerist solutions. Moral gestures substitute for substantive change. Even moral philosophy itself has not escaped this reduction. Applied ethics often devolves into case studies and hypothetical dilemmas, as if morality were a puzzle to be solved rather than a life to be lived. The trolley problem, for instance, abstracts ethical reasoning from the complexities of human relationships. MacIntyre dismisses such thought experiments as symptomatic of modernity's detachment from embodied virtue. The rise of technocratic governance further illustrates this detachment. Policymakers increasingly rely on cost-benefit analyses, treating ethical questions as logistical challenges. Healthcare rationing or algorithmic policing, for example, are framed as neutral calculations, obscuring the value judgments they entail. This illusion of objectivity masks the moral vacuum at the heart of decision-making. MacIntyre reserves particular scorn for the language of human rights, which he views as a fragmented relic of older traditions. Without the theological or philosophical foundations that once gave rights meaning, they become rhetorical weapons in ideological battle. One group's rights claims often directly conflict with another's, with no higher framework to adjudicate between them. The result is a zero-sum politics of competing entitlements. This rights-based discourse also individualizes morality, eroding the communal bonds essential for virtue. When justice is framed as personal entitlement rather than shared responsibility, solidarity withers. The modern welfare state, for instance, administers aid through impersonal systems, severing the reciprocal ties that once linked giver and receiver. Charity becomes bureaucratic transaction, not moral relationship. The illusion of progress is perhaps most stark in the realm of technology. Innovations like social media are hailed as tools for connection, yet they often amplify alienation and polarization. Silicon Valley's mantra of moving fast and breaking things applies not just to code, but to social norms, with little regard for the virtues disrupted in the process. What is lost, attention, patience, empathy, rarely factors into the calculus of disruption. MacIntyre's critique extends to education, where moral formation has been supplanted by credentialing. Universities prioritize skills over character, producing graduates adept at instrumental reasoning, but untrained in practical wisdom. The liberal arts, once a venue for cultivating virtue, are now justified in terms of employability. This shift reflects modernity's broader prioritization of means over ends. Against this backdrop, MacIntyre's call for tradition-constituted rationality takes on renewed urgency. Only by reclaiming the narratives and practices that embed morality in communal life can we escape the cycle of false progress. This is not a rejection of change, but a demand for change rooted in continuity, a recognition that ethical growth requires tethering innovation to enduring goods. The task ahead is not to invent new moral systems, but to recover the capacity for moral judgment. This begins in small communities, families, workplaces, local associations where virtues are practiced, not just theorized. Here, the gap between principle and action narrows, and moral language regains its lived meaning. The question is whether such communities can thrive within a fragmented modernity. MacIntyre's challenge is clear. Until we confront the illusions underpinning contemporary ethics, moral progress will remain a mirage. The work of rebuilding cannot begin without first acknowledging how much has been lost. MacIntyre's critique, while damning, is not a counsel of despair. His diagnosis of modernity's moral bankruptcy is paired with a tentative prescription, the cultivation of local communities where virtue can be rediscovered through shared practices. These microcosms of ethical life, whether religious orders, artisan guilds, or activist collectives, offer a counterpoint to the alienation of bureaucratic individualism. Within them, moral reasoning regains its narrative coherence, as individuals learn to see their actions as contributions to a common good, rather than expressions of private will. Such communities thrive on what MacIntyre calls practices, sustained cooperative activities whose standards of excellence are internal to their pursuit. A musician striving for mastery, for instance, submits to the discipline of the craft, measuring success not by fame or profit, but by fidelity to the art itself. These practices foster virtues like patience, humility, and honesty, which are reinforced through collective accountability. Unlike abstract moral rules, they provide concrete contexts where ethical development is inseparable from daily effort. Yet, the viability of these communities hinges on their resistance to co-optation. Modern capitalism, with its logic of commodification, has a habit of absorbing dissent into marketable trends. Mindfulness becomes a productivity hack. Activism is diluted into brand-friendly slogans. For MacIntyre, the challenge is to insulate practices from instrumentalization, preserving their integrity against the pressures of efficiency and scale. A farmers' cooperative that prioritizes sustainability over profit, for example, must actively reject the temptation to compromise its values for growth. Education plays a pivotal role in this reconstruction. Traditional apprenticeships, where knowledge is passed down through lived example, contrast sharply with modern pedagogy's emphasis on standardized outcomes. To teach virtue, MacIntyre suggests, requires immersion in traditions where mentors embody the very qualities they seek to instill. A young scientist learns integrity not from a textbook, but by observing a senior researcher who refuses to falsify data. This relational model of learning resists the fragmentation of knowledge into disconnected competencies. The resurgence of interest in craft and place-based movements, from urban gardening to folk revivalism, hints at a latent hunger for this kind of rootedness. These efforts, though often small, reject the homogenizing forces of globalization, insisting instead on the value of local specificity. A weaver preserving ancestral techniques or a community organizing around land stewardship demonstrates how practices can anchor moral life in tangible realities. Their work quietly contests the assumption that progress must mean rupture with the past. Critics might dismiss such efforts as nostalgic or impractical in the face of systemic crises. Yet MacIntyre's point is precisely that large-scale solutions often replicate the problems they aim to solve. Climate policy, drafted by distant experts, for instance, frequently ignores the wisdom of indigenous communities who have sustained ecosystems for generations. Moral reconstruction begins not with grand declarations, but with the patient work of re-inhabiting traditions that align human flourishing with ethological and social limits. The role of narrative is central to this project. Virtue requires understanding one's life as part of an ongoing story, one that links past, present, and future. Modernity's obsession with the new severs these connections, leaving individuals adrift in an eternal present. By contrast, communities that curate their histories through oral storytelling, ritual, or collective memory provide a framework for moral continuity. A labor union that honors its founders' struggles, for example, grounds current demands in a legacy of solidarity. Religion, for MacIntyre, remains a potent reservoir of such narratives, though not the only one. Even secular traditions can foster moral coherence if they sustain practices that transcend individual preference. The civil rights movement drew strength from the Black Church's fusion of spiritual and ethical vision, translating theological concepts like the beloved community into social action. This integration of belief and practice exemplifies how tradition can fuel radical change without succumbing to abstraction. The political implications of this approach are deliberately modest. MacIntyre's skepticism of state-driven solutions stems from their tendency to impose uniformity. Instead, he advocates for a politics of local particularity, where diverse moral traditions coexist without collapsing into relativism. This pluralism demands humility. No single community can claim universal authority, yet each must remain open to critique from others. A Mennonite farming collective and a feminist cooperative might differ in values, but share a commitment to non-exploitative labor. The obstacle, of course, is modernity's entrenched individualism. Relearning the habits of interdependence, mutual aid, shared sacrifice, collective celebration, requires unlearning the myth of self-sufficiency. It also demands confronting the discomfort of constraint. Virtues like fidelity or temperance limit freedom in the service of deeper goods. The modern self, accustomed to endless choice, may chase at such boundaries, mistaking them for oppression rather than the conditions of flourishing. Technology, too, poses a dilemma. While it can facilitate connection, its design often undermines the very virtues communities seek to cultivate. Social media's algorithmic incentives reward outrage over nuance. Remote work erodes the embodied presence essential for trust. Reconstructing moral life may necessitate deliberate resistance, choosing tools that serve human ends rather than reshaping humans to serve technical efficiency. The honest practice of selectively adopting technology offers a provocative model of such discernment. MacIntyre's vision is neither utopian nor reactionary. He does not imagine a return to a pre-modern past, but insists that the future of ethics depends on reclaiming what modernity discarded, the understanding that morality is lived, not theorized. This work is incremental, often invisible to the broader culture. A teacher prioritizing her students' character over test scores, or a neighborhood reviving its potluck tradition contributes as much to moral reconstruction as any philosopher. The question is whether these fragments can coalesce into something greater. MacIntyre's answer is cautious. No single movement will mend modernity's fractures, but the cumulative effect of countless local efforts may forge new possibilities. The alternative, a world where moral language is reduced to manipulation or silence, is too bleak to accept. Reconstruction begins where it always has, in small, stubborn acts of faithfulness to what is good. MacIntyre's vision of moral reconstruction, though compelling, faces formidable obstacles in a world structured by competing logics of power and profit. The very institutions that dominate modern life, corporations, governments, even educational systems, are often antithetical to the cultivation of virtue. Their priorities, efficiency, scalability, and short-term gains clash with the slow, relational work of ethical formation. A community dedicated to craftsmanship, for instance, must contend with market pressures that prioritize mass production over quality. The tension between internal goods and external rewards is relentless. This hostility is not merely economic but cultural. Late modernity valorizes autonomy and self-invention, framing tradition as constraint rather than wisdom. The rise of digital identities, where personas are curated and discarded at will, exacerbates this disconnect. Virtue requires stability, a commitment to roles and relationships that transcend fleeting preferences. Yet algorithms reward perpetual reinvention, eroding the continuity essential for character development. How can one practice fidelity in a culture that equates freedom with detachment? The erosion of intermediary institutions, churches, unions, civic groups, has further weakened the scaffolding for virtuous communities. These structures once provided spaces where moral norms were reinforced through collective ritual and mutual accountability. Their decline leaves individuals isolated, reliant on abstract state or market mechanisms for guidance. A young adult today may encounter countless ethical frameworks online, but lack the embodied community to discern which are worth embracing. The result is often a shallow eclecticism, where values are adopted and abandoned like fashion trends. Even those who commit to local practices face the challenge of scale. Climate change, economic inequality, and geopolitical strife demand responses beyond the capacity of small communities. Virtue ethics, focused on proximate relationships, risks seeming parochial in the face of global crises. Can a farmer's market's ethos of sustainability meaningfully challenge industrial agriculture? MacIntyre would argue that systemic change must emerge from the ground up, yet the urgency of these crises tempts many toward top-down solutions despite their moral compromises. The commodification of resistance itself poses a paradox. Movements that begin as critiques of capitalism are often absorbed into its logic. Their symbols, stripped of substance and sold as lifestyle choices. Punk music's anti-establishment rage becomes a mall aesthetic. Feminist slogans adorn fast fashion t-shirts. This dynamic forces virtuous communities into a defensive posture, perpetually guarding against co-optation. The energy spent maintaining boundaries might otherwise fuel creative growth. Education's transformation into credentialing exacerbates these tensions. Schools that once nurtured character now prioritize employability, reducing ethics to compliance training. A student learns to cite corporate diversity policies but not to practice solidarity with cafeteria workers. The rare teacher who emphasizes virtue must do so against institutional inertia, where success is measured in test scores and college placements. Reforming such systems from within seems Herculean, yet abandoning them risks ceding the next generation entirely to instrumental logic. Technology's double-edged nature further complicates reconstruction. Digital tools can connect dispersed communities, enabling knowledge sharing among traditional craftspeople or activists. Yet, these platforms are designed to monetize attention, privileging engagement over depth. A virtual book club discussing Aristotle must compete with algorithms optimized to distract. The very medium that enables connection may undermine the focus required for serious moral reflection. Religious communities, historically central to virtue formation, now grapple with their own crises of authority and relevance. Scandals and sectarianism have eroded trust, while secularism relegates faith to the private sphere. Yet even diminished, these traditions retain reservoirs of ritual and narrative that secular alternatives struggle to replicate. A Unitarian congregation blending ancient liturgy with social justice work, for example, demonstrates how tradition can adapt without dissolving. The challenge is to renew without diluting. The political landscape offers little respite. Liberal democracy's emphasis on individual rights often sidelines the communal bonds virtue requires. Policies that could support ethical communities, land reform, cooperative ownership, are marginalized in favor of neoliberal reforms. Meanwhile, reactionary movements exploit the hunger for belonging, offering rigid identities in place of genuine moral inquiry. Navigating this terrain demands discernment, how to advocate for structural change without replicating the impersonal systems MacIntyre critiques. Despite these challenges, signs of resilience persist. Mutual aid networks emerging in crisis zones, from hurricane relief to pandemic support, demonstrate how virtue flourishes in necessity. These groups can operate on principles of reciprocity, rather than on charity, reviving the ancient understanding that dependence is not weakness but the ground of solidarity. Their existence hints at an alternative moral economy, one that prioritizes care over control. The orcs, too, remain a vital site of resistance. A novelist weaving themes of integrity into her work, or a playwright staging dialogues about justice, keeps moral imagination alive in a culture prone to reductionism. Unlike academic philosophy, these mediums engage emotions and intuition, bridging the gap between abstract principle and lived experience. It reminds us that virtue is not just thought but felt. The task ahead is neither to despair nor to romanticize the past, but to cultivate what MacIntyre calls the virtues of acknowledged dependence. This begins with humility, recognizing that no individual or community is self-sufficient. It requires courage to resist dominant logics without retreating into nostalgia. Most crucially, it demands patience, the willingness to plant seeds whose fruit others may harvest. The reconstruction of moral life will not be televised or monetized. It will unfold in quiet corners. A mentor passing on a skill, a neighborhood reviving a festival, a family choosing deliberation or distraction. These acts are fragments, yet together they weave a counter-narrative to modernity's fragmentation. The question is not whether they will succeed by conventional metrics, but whether they can sustain enough light to see by in gathering darkness. MacIntyre's project, ultimately, is an invitation to live as if the good life is still possible, not as a given, but as a practice. The world may remain hostile, but it cannot abolish the stubborn human capacity for excellence, connection, and hope. That, perhaps, is enough to begin. The urgency of MacIntyre's project becomes starkly visible in moments of societal collapse, when pandemics, wars, or ecological disasters expose the fragility of modernity's moral infrastructure. These crises reveal how thin commitments to rights or utility prove when systems falter. Hoarding, during supply shortages, for instance, reflects the failure of abstract ethics to cultivate shared responsibility. By contrast, communities grounded in practices of mutual aid often demonstrate remarkable resilience, precisely because their bonds are forged through sustained interdependence rather than transactional need. Such moments lay bare the latent resources within tradition-constituted communities. During the 2020 pandemic, grassroots networks emerged to deliver groceries to vulnerable neighbors, echoing medieval guilds as care for their members. These efforts were not coordinated by governments, but arose from habitual virtues, compassion, solidarity, practical wisdom, honed through everyday interactions. Their effectiveness suggests that moral reconstruction is not merely theoretical, but a matter of survival. When institutions fail, it is the local and the particular that sustain life. Yet crises also intensified modernity's centrifugal forces. Authoritarian regimes exploit emergencies to consolidate power, framing collective good as obedience to centralized authority. Meanwhile, libertarian individualism resists even modest sacrifices for others, treating masks or vaccines as personal choices rather than communal obligations. Both responses exemplify the poverty of moral language divorced from shared ends. Without a robust conception of the common good, crisis management devolves into coercion or chaos. Environmental collapse presents perhaps the most profound test for virtue ethics. Climate change demands collective action on a global scale, yet its solutions cannot rely solely on technocratic fixes. Carbon taxes and green technology may mitigate harm, but they fail to address the underlying cultural drivers, consumerism, disposability, the illusion of human separateness from nature. MacIntyre's emphasis on practices offers an alternative. Communities that model sustainable living not as austerity, but as flourishing. Indigenous stewardship traditions, for example, demonstrate how virtue can align human activity with ecological limits. The tension between local practices and systemic change remains unresolved. Can a network of eco-villages meaningfully counter industrial capitalism's ravages? MacIntyre might respond that large-scale transformation must emerge organically from the convergence of countless small resistances. The civil rights movement's power, after all, lay not in federal decrees, but in church basements and lunch counter sit-ins, spaces where moral vision was enacted daily. Similarly, climate resilience may depend less on international summits than on watershed councils and urban gardening cooperatives. Technology's role in this crisis is deeply ambivalent. Digital platforms enable global coordination among activists, yet their extractive designs often undermine the attentiveness virtue requires. A climate strike organized by a social media may garner headlines, but lasting change depends on deeper shifts, relearning skills like repair, seasonal eating, or conflict resolution that algorithms cannot commodify. The challenge is to harness tools without surrendering to their logic. The rise of artificial intelligence further complicates this landscape. Automated systems increasingly mediate human relationships, from algorithmic hiring to care robots for the elderly. MacIntyre's framework would view these developments with skepticism, not because they are inherently immoral, but because they risk displacing the context where moral character is formed. A child raised by a chatbot may learn facts but miss the embodied cues, a mentor's frown of disapproval or smile of encouragement that convey ethical nuance. The virtue cannot be coded, it must be lived. Economic instability, similarly, tests the viability of virtuous communities. In an era of gig work and precarious housing, the time and stability required for practices like apprenticeship or communal farming grow scarce. When survival depends on hustling, who can afford the luxury of craftsmanship or delivered in democracy? This material reality underscores MacIntyre's insistence that moral reconstruction cannot be purely cultural. It must confront political economy. Cooperatives and land trusts offer glimpses of alternatives, but their scalability remains contested. The cultural dominance of cynicism poses another obstacle. Irony and detachment are default postures in late modernity, shielding individuals from the vulnerability that virtue demands. To commit seriously to a tradition or practice requires risking ridicule. Think of the earnestness of a novice potter or a community organizer in a world that prizes sarcasm. Recovering moral seriousness means defying the fear of appearing uncool or naive, a social cost many are unwilling to bear. Despite these hurdles, moments of crisis also create openings. The erosion of trust in institutions has sparked renewed interest in participatory democracy, from citizen assemblies to workplace cooperatives. These experiments, though fragile, reject a false choice between individualism and authoritarianism, instead modeling decision-making rooted in dialogue and shared purpose. They embody the Aristotelian ideal of politics as an extension of ethics, not the art of power, but the practice of collective flourishing. The arts and humanities, though marginalized under technocratic regimes, retain subversive potential. A novel exploring moral ambiguity or a philosophy seminar dissecting MacIntyre's critiques can awaken the imaginative capacity essential for ethical life. These disciplines nurture the ability to dwell with complexity, resisting the reductive binaries, us versus them, progress versus backwardness, that dominate crisis discourse. Their survival is not a luxury, but a necessity for any meaningful reconstruction. Religion's role remains paradoxical. While institutional faiths struggle with decline, the human hunger for transcendence persists, often manifesting in secular forms. Yoga studios as sites of community, environmentalism as cosmic stewardship. MacIntyre would caution against diluting tradition's thickness, yet these hybrid movements suggest that virtue can adapt to new containers. The key is whether they foster genuine practices or merely aestheticized spirituality. The path forward is neither pure resistance nor wholesale withdrawal. Virtuous communities must engage the wider world, advocating for policies that protect their autonomy, forming alliances across differences, and offering counterexamples to dominant norms. A local food cooperative might lobby for agricultural reforms while maintaining its own standards of sustainability. This dual posture, rooted yet outward-facing, avoids both isolation and assimilation. MacIntyre's project, then, is not a blueprint, but a provocation. In a world careening between crisis and complacency, it asks, what practices can sustain us when systems fail? What narratives can bind us when ideologies fracture? The answers will not emerge from grand theories, but from the stubborn, unglamorous work of planting gardens, raising children, and reconciling conflicts. one small act of faithfulness at a time. The measure of success is not dominance but persistence. Like medieval monks preserving texts through dark ages, today's virtuous communities may seem marginal until the moment their wisdom becomes indispensable. Their task is not to win, but to endure, to keep alive the possibility of a life well lived, even in shadow. That endurance, MacIntyre reminds us, is itself a virtue. MacIntyre's critique leaves no doubt. Modernity's moral frameworks have failed to provide the coherence necessary for genuine human flourishing. Yet, within this failure lies an invitation not to nostalgia but to the patient work of rebuilding. The task ahead is not to devise new abstract systems, but to reclaim the moral imagination, grounding ethics in the lived practices that shape character and community. This is neither a retreat nor a surrender, but a defiant commitment to what endures. The fragmentation of moral discourse cannot be overcome through sheer will or intellectual ingenuity. It requires the cultivation of spaces, physical and conceptual, where virtue is not merely discussed but enacted. A classroom that prioritizes dialogue over testing, a workplace that values collaboration over competition, or a neighborhood that practices mutual aid over transactional exchange, each becomes a site of resistance against modernity's corrosive individualism. These are not utopian ideals, but tangible possibilities, already emerging in the margins of a fractured world. The urgency of this work is underscored by the escalating crises of our time: climate collapse, political polarization, and technological alienation demand more than technical solutions. They call for a reorientation of human purpose. MacIntyre's insistence on merit of unity reminds us that we are not isolated actors but participants in shared stories. To act virtuously is to recognize how our choices ripple across time, binding us to past generations and those yet unborn. This perspective transforms moral responsibility from a burden into a legacy. Critics may argue that local practices lack the scale to address global challenges. Yet, history shows that transformative movements often begin as marginal experiments. Think of the abolitionists, suffragists, or civil rights activists, whose small, steadfast communities eventually shifted the moral horizon. The lesson is not to dismiss incremental efforts, but to trust their cumulative power. A single act of integrity, a journalist refusing to compromise truth, a worker organizing for fair wages, becomes a beacon in a culture adrift. The recovery of virtue also demands a reckoning with modernity's illusions. The myth of endless growth, the cult of efficiency, and a fetish of individual choice must be unmasked as obstacles to flourishing. This does not mean rejecting innovation, but subordinating it to ethical ends. Technology, economics, and politics should serve human goods, not redefine them. The Amish practice of Gelassenheit, or yielding to communal discernment, offers a radical alternative to the hubris of unrestrained progress. Education must be reimagined as moral formation rather than credentialing. Schools that nurture wisdom alongside skills, apprenticeships that blend technique with character, and mentors who model integrity in their daily lives are all essential to this renewal. The goal is not to indoctrinate, but to equip individuals to navigate complexity with discernment. A society that prizes such education invests in its own ethical future. The arts and humanities have a vital role in this project. Literature, music, and philosophy cultivate the empathy and imagination that rigid ideologies suppress. They remind us that moral life is as much about beauty and sorrow as it is about rules and outcomes. To defend these disciplines against utilitarian cuts is to safeguard the very tools of epical reflection. A culture that abandons them abandons its soul. This is not a call to abandon systemic engagement, but to anchor it in deeper commitments. Policy reforms matter, but they will falter without the virtues that sustain them. A just economy requires not only redistributive mechanisms, but citizens capable of solidarity and restraint. Environmental protection depends not just on regulations, but on communities that cherish their land. The interplay between structure and characters where lasting change takes root. The challenge ultimately is to live as if the good life is possible, not as a distant ideal, but as a present practice. This demands courage, the courage to resist cynicism, to embrace constraint, and to trust in traditions that defy modernity's amnesia. It also demands humility, recognizing that no single community holds a monopoly on virtue. The work of moral reconstruction is collective, iterative, and mercifully unfinished. Begin where you are. Join a practice that aligns with your deepest commitments. Resist the forces that fragment your moral language, and above all, refuse the lie that ethics is a private matter. Virtue grows in the soil of shared struggle and celebration. The future of moral life depends not on grand theories, but on countless ordinary acts of faithfulness.